Morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Jess and Greta. It's been a real pleasure to be here the last day or two. It's a very different kind of experience for me, but I've been learning a tremendous amount. So thank you for having me with you. Um, so 2 points just as I get going. The first is that Jess's brief to me was to give an overview of just war theory, just war tradition, which also attempts to some degree to get behind and underneath it, to give a more critical account of it. So that's largely what I'm going to be doing. It also kind of fortuitously, I think, follows from Benny's talk last night, which I found quite inspirational. So the title is There It Is, The Absurdity of Just War Theory. And the jump off point for this was my realization during the year that one of the frequently overlooked, but I think significant details to emerge from the investigation into Australian war crimes in Afghanistan is that the misdeeds in question were reported and indeed in some cases even testified to by Australian troops who had witnessed them or who had otherwise become aware of them. These, I think, courageous troops felt obliged to call out these acts of wrongdoing as a matter of honour, integrity, principle. Now, how they arrived at the decision to speak out against their erstwhile colleagues, I do not know, though I can imagine that the kinds of considerations that they must have been balancing. Most obviously, loyalty to their units versus ethical concerns about the unlawful killing of detainees and related practices. Now, while these soldiers earn my respect and admiration, I mention them not just for the sake of it, but because I think their story holds a lot of promise for us. Now, it's tempting to rehearse the stories, the facts of what Ben Roberts-Smith and his associates did, and to argue that they reveal something morally rotten within the ranks of the ADF more generally. There may be some truth in this, but if so, there must also be truth in the claim that the actions of those troops who spoke out against what Ben Roberts-Smith et al. Did reflects positively on our armed forces. Their examples suggest that even now there may be something in the Digger ideal which entrains Australian soldiers to choose the hard right over the easy wrong, no matter the circumstances. Now, I don't want to go down and talk about some kind of Anzac myth, but what I do want to suggest, or my intention is to suggest, that when it comes to reflecting on how the ADF as an institution educates its members to think ethically about war, which is what we're doing over this 2 days, if anything, we would do well perhaps to pay more attention to the stories and experiences of our own war personnel, of our own service personnel. Now, there is, of course, risk attached to this. I often think of the line from Tim O'Brien, the Vietnam novelist and memoirist, US veteran of Vietnam, who the line "there it is" of course, from. He put it nicely when he warned that if you send boys off to war, you shouldn't be too surprised if they come back talking dirty, quote unquote. Returning soldiers, the argument goes, are more likely to have an earthy way of putting things that is likely to offend the pearl-clutching brigade. This, I would submit, might be exactly what we need. So what I want to do over the next however many minutes is flesh this argument out. And I'll do so first by saying a few words about just war theory, then offering a brief discussion of what I think are 4 exemplary Australian war stories, and finally, by way of conclusion, considering how storytelling might equip us to confront the absurdity inherent in the idea that it is possible to wage war in an ethical manner. So, opening point, there's a passage in Homer's Iliad which sticks in my mind. And it's not because it's especially poignant or meaningful or freighted with meaning or anything like this, but for the much more immature reason that the Penguin translation of it is evocative of teen fan fiction. The scene, and I don't know if any of you know it, is Diomedes sledging Paris as he challenges him to combat. "You're all hairstyle and bedroom eyes," is the line, which I'm pretty sure was not the original Greek, but never mind, that's what Penguin gives us. And I want to return to this passage a little bit later, "You're all hairstyle and bedroom eyes," because I think this cuts to the quick in some ways of what I want to say about just war theory. Now, we're all familiar with just war theory. I think we're all familiar with just war theory, yeah? people relatively comfortable with the concepts. You've all been introduced to it and so forth. So I'm not going to labor the point of it, but I will say a few words about how I understand it, just to kind of set the table, as it were. Now, I view just war theory as a framework that helps us structure our ethical deliberations about war. And leading into this, I should say, I'm not going to, well, how would I put it? I guess, well, by framework, I mean that it guides us to the salient questions and concerns that we might like to consider in our ethical reasoning about war. So, for instance, is there a just cause for the use of force in this instance? And what might we understand by the idea of just cause? Would it be proportionate to levy force for this purpose? How would we calculate what proportionality looks like in a case such as this? So please note for this, and I think this is important, these are questions to ask, not criteria to plug in or tick boxes. This is not an algorithmic framework, right, where you just simply tick it off and, hey, presto, you're done. Or if you achieve 60% or 70% of them compliance, you're good to go. It doesn't function like that. Just war, the principles or categories of the just war theory, which you'll be to some degree already familiar with, which are listed up here, the ad bellum and the in bello, these are not answers to questions, right? These are the questions we ask. And in some ways, they're vortexes which continue to open and to complexify the more you look into what they mean. So the more you look into these questions, the more difficult they become. But what they do for us, I think, is they draw our attention to precisely what kind of questions we should be asking. What are the concerns and the values that we should be paying attention to when we're deliberating and evaluating the use of force in any particular context? Now, as I say, the more we dig into these prompts, the more complexity and ambiguity we discover in them. So for instance, if you want to look at jus in bello proportionality, it sounds simple when you say it, but when you actually try to operationalize it, it becomes very, very fuzzy indeed. Very, very baggy, very unclear. Now, this is really good for academics because we can argue about it and publish stuff and therefore make careers. And hello, how are you this morning? But it's probably less good for soldiers and commanders in their field, precisely because it's not a black and white set of rules. It's not a toolbox that you can just simply apply. You also have to interrogate it. Now, so how did we arrive at this view? Well, the categories of just war theory, just cause, proper authority, and so forth, are not, of course, recent or purely theoretical constructs. On the contrary, they're the product of a long history. They're, I would say, the distillation of about 2,500 years of ethical deliberation on war. So they encapsulate in a particular way a kind of wisdom of the ages of how human societies have argued and investigated and deliberated on the use of force and the ethical questions that it raises. The standard history is worth briefly recapping, but not getting too lost on. Anybody know this fellow with the bit of fire coming out of his head? St. Augustine, or Augustine, or however you wish to say it. Depends on whether you're from the west of Ireland or the east of Ireland. But anyway, St. Augustine, for those of you who don't know him, was a 4th century bishop in what would now be North Africa and what was then the edge of the Roman Empire. St. Augustine is probably most widely known to, well, I suppose, Christian boys and girls the world over for his prayer as a young man, Lord, grant me the strength to be chaste, but just not yet. He was a wayward young fellow who only later in life was drawn back to the church and subsequently elevated through the ranks very swiftly to become a bishop. And in that role, he had spiritual leadership over a rather large congregation, over a flock, who he sought to guide through quite difficult times in the North African Christian community of that time, including the use of force. Now, the big issue in St. Augustine's lifetime, as I said, at the tail end of the 4th century, was beginning of the 5th century. The sack of Rome took place in 410. And of course, the Romans, majority pagan, blamed this on the Christians, who were hitherto pacifists. and who had been withdrawn from public life because they're waiting for the second coming. So they're saying effectively, the Christian population is saying, we don't get involved in the tawdry business of war and serving the state because we serve our heavenly king who is coming back any day now. The Roman population was dissatisfied with this because what they saw this as being was a sort of, they perceived Christians to be occupying a parasitical position in their society. You're living in our cities under our roofs, you're enjoying the security we give you, but you're not sacrificing for it. When trouble happens, you go to the church and pray while you let us bleed for you. That's why we're weak. You are bringing us down from the inside. So Augustine sought to square that circle, and he sought to articulate a rationale or justification for why Christians could engage in war and serve in the Roman army without incurring sin. And in some sense, the argument that which becomes hugely influential, obviously, in Western political theology, is somewhat a kind of a proto-Star Wars, proto-Jedi ethic, in which he says you can engage in war so long as you do so with love for the enemy. And if you're acting with love in your heart and you're attempting to, not to smite the wrongdoer, but to dissuade them of their wrongdoing, to punish them from their wrongdoing so that they're directed back to righteousness. So wage war with love in your heart for your enemy, hate their sin, love them. And the only place where war becomes wrong, and this is his line, what is evil in war? It is not that some men will kill and some will die, for this will happen anyway. What's evil in war is the lust for domination that it will stir in the breast of some men. Jedi ethic, really clearly, in terms of he's saying, what war does is it draws you to the dark side. It leads you to hate. And if you get drawn into that cycle, you're lost. You're drawn into a world of sinfulness. But that's not necessary. You can, with strength and with faith, wage war with love in your heart. So that view is scattered across something like Augustine's 413 books. So he was not lazy. It's not until the 12th or 13th century that it gets systematized by Thomas Aquinas in the top right as you look. And Thomas Aquinas, what he does is he gathers together all of St. Augustine's writings and he basically synthesizes them into 3 pages in Summa Theologia with the chapter entitled, Is It Always a Sin to Wage War? And it's there that we see the first articulation of just cause, proper authority, right intention. And those are the guiding criteria that he lists. And they're kind of distillations of what Augustine was saying, put into a language, which subsequently gets institutionalized as church law, as canon law. Bear in mind, of course, we're talking about 12th century Western Europe. So church law is, to reuse the term is proto-international law at that time. That is the major driver of any kind of institutionalized life in Western Europe at the time. The other people here who are pictured, and I'll mention two of them there just very briefly before we come to the third. We have Christine de Pizan here. Christine de Pizan is, I think, a really fascinating figure. And I think this comes back to Benny's project in an elliptical way. One of the things that she did was she was well-versed in canon law, in Aquinas and all of those followers to Aquinas. But she said that this was very removed from the life of the fighting classes, who were not necessarily versed in canon law. And I think of somebody like, and Charles has heard me talk about William the Marshal before, who was a 12th century English knight, the most prestigious knight of the day. And when he was lying, he had crusaded, Battle of Lincoln, so on and so on. Some of you will know more about him than me. Also played by William Hurt in a really bad Robin Hood movie, so you know. But William the Marshal, when he was on his deathbed, one of his less sensitive courtiers approached him and said, "Are you scared, William? You know, you've been doing a lot of war, so you're probably not going to go to heaven, huh?" To which William said, "That's not true. That's not true. Don't mind the churchmen. They shave us too closely. If a man such as me, who's always warred honorably, cannot go to heaven, well, then there's no heaven for anyone." Now, the really crucial point there is, I think, the argument that the churchmen shave us too closely. And this is a kind of an early, you hear echoes of this today when you listen to Chris Kyle or whoever, Marcus Luttrell say, or Soldier A in Australia, don't mind the rules of engagement. They're written by policymakers in Canberra. They don't know what it's like out there. And while we might like to reject certain formulations of that, there is nevertheless a certain truth to it, insofar as you certainly want the rules to engage the people who are having to put them into practice. You want them to be meaningful, to be intelligible, and to speak to the realities of what they're doing. There's no point in promulgating rules if they're impossible to apply or to live by. So Christine de Puzan was challenged by this and said, I want to put canon law in conversation with the chivalric code as she understood it, evolving from people like William the Marshal and so forth. So just war tradition acquires this kind of more practical element, whereas it once had been the preserve of just eggheads and scholars and priests and so forth. Fast forward, the last fellow up there, and I'm not going to bang on about him in any depth, is Hugo Grotius. And Hugo Grotius is writing in the 17th century and updates just war theory to account for the Treaty of Westphalia and the emergence of state sovereignty as a prevailing doctrine, and basically codifies just war theory as a nascent international law. And Lauren and others will be able to tell you far more about that than me, so I defer gladly there on that. But finally, we arrive at this fellow in the middle, who is Michael Walzer. And Michael Walzer wrote the most famous book on just war theory in the past 200 years, Just and Unjust Wars, which I commend you to read. It's quite an enjoyable read. It's quite a disputatious book. It's a book that makes you want to argue with it. And it's surprisingly complex. It reads like a dream, but you get so far and then you realize, I don't actually understand what he's saying, and you have to go back over it and pick it out. But it's a book that kind of grabs you by the collar and challenges you. And what this book does in some ways is it recasts the prevailing theory of just war in the vocabulary of human rights. And it's around this time in the 1970s that just war theory comes to be presented in the schematic form that we saw earlier, in this form, the ad bellum, in bello, etc. Now, rounding off this, I should note that Walzer's framing has been the subject of sustained criticism over the past 2 decades by so-called revisionist just war theories. I want to say something about them a little bit later, but not just now. More immediately, I want to put it to you that Walzer's statement of purpose in Just and Unjust Wars provides a very good way in for us to grasping the significance of just war theory today, for better or for worse. Walzer writes in the foreword to Just and Unjust Wars that he was not attracted to just war theory for scholarly or academic purposes or anything like that. Rather, he encountered it as an anti-Vietnam War protester. And he was coming out of an American political science academy, which didn't do international relations, IR theory, which didn't do justice, which was all the language of power and realpolitik, balance of power, etc., domino theory, strategic deterrence, so forth. They didn't do the language of justice. So he said he was quite confronted when he joined these marches. He saw these placards with phrases like just cause, non-combatant immunity, disproportionate, so on and so forth. He said he had some intuitive grasp of what they meant, and he knew they were powerful, but he didn't know why, and he didn't know where they came from. But he knew they communicated some deep truth which was widely intelligible and which connected with him and with many other people emotively. So he said that in his quieter days, he would, well, let me just bookmark that there for a moment. I think that speaks to a truth, which is that while I'm banging on up here about what just war theory is and showing you, the schematic of it, these are all things which you all already know. And I wager that you all already knew them before you even attended any lecture on them the first time, because these are the kind of categories that we use when we're arguing about war in the pub with our pals or in the coffee shop or wherever, reading the newspaper, watching the news. This language is deeply sedimented in our culture around us. So it's, even if we don't always have the exact words or the exact vocabulary, when we see it, it seems kind of commonsensical to us. So, you know, if there's a line about being a poet and we didn't know it, I think what Walzer is saying here is that we're all just war theorists, even if we didn't already know it. And his job in the book is just to kind of sharpen that vocabulary and to bring it to the fore so that we can better understand what it's doing and how it's moving us and why. And he promised himself that when things calm down, he'd return and write a book about this and discover what it is. So that's where that book comes from. Now, it's also true that the language of just war theory has become more pervasive over the past 50 years. When Walzer joined those anti-Vietnam War protests in 1970s, he said he was only dimly aware of the language of just cause. It spoke to him instinctively on a gut level, but he had never been taught about it. And this is because just war theory until then was the kind of niche preserve of Catholic seminary schools and theologians. It wasn't a popular discourse in any particular way. A lot has changed since then. Since the 1990s, just war theory has arguably become the lingua franca of political and military leaders the world over. And it's become normalized and embedded and hardwired into how we talk about war, whether that's in university classrooms or military bases or wherever you have it, or on the news. Some people write about this as they've referred to it even as the triumph of just war theory, that it has colonized how we speak about war today. Now, there are good reasons for celebrating the so-called triumph of just war theory, or, you know, we might suppose that there are. The fact that state leaders and generals now habitually apply the language of justice and restraint to the use of force can't be anything other than a good thing, or so we might suppose. I want to suggest there are grounds for skepticism, and I'll draw attention to, I want to give you a little vignette, and again, I think Charles was probably familiar with this, my apologies, Charles, which I think draws this out. And this is President George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder, on the eve of the 1991 Gulf War, getting, in General Ryan's language, a little bit wobbly. He was feeling the pressure, the weight of committing young men and women into harm's way to kill or be killed on the eve of battle. So he summoned a family cleric to the Oval Office to talk him through the decision he was about to make. And he apparently, in this story, by the way, it's presumably not true. It's told by Peter Teems in his book. And even if it's not true, it probably should be. So it's kind of a helpful little device. He tells the story that Bush challenged the cleric, an old family friend. Hey, I know there's this Christian theory of war, just war theory. I want you to talk me through it. So the pastor spoke to him for some period, for some length of time about it. And at the end of it, President Bush said, that's really, really helpful. Thank you. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to crib down those principles on an index card for me. So the same ones we saw just a moment ago. And Bush, after he left, put that index card in his shirt pocket. And the story has it that he kept it right there the whole way through the war until it concluded. Now, you can read this in a very positive way, and you can say, that's really impressive that this language of justice and restraint is right there at the heart of power, at this most testing moment, right when the realists tell you that justice and ideals evaporate and it's all power. Well, actually, the closest thing to the president's heart all through that war is just war theory. But the more cynical reading is that just war theory is in the pocket of power. It was never going to change what Bush was going to do. It merely gave him a very nice, shiny, and polite language with which to sell this to a skeptical public, to lend his war the sheen of legitimacy. Lipstick for pigs, if you want to put it that way. It's up to you. In some ways, that's what you take from that story, whether you see it as a good thing, whether you see it as a bad thing, whether you're more cynical or optimistic, is down to the kind of person that you are in terms of how you read these things. I'd like to take a moment then just to tell you about where I come down on that before I pivot to some war stories and conclude with them. So before I moved to Australia, which was just 4 or 5 years ago, I'd always positioned myself as critical friend of just war theory in some way. I write about just war theory, but have been quite critical about it. But my interest in it was primarily exclusively academic. So I was interested in it in terms of the history of political thought that gives rise to it and how that thought gets deployed and mobilized by political leaders today. During this period of working in the UK for 15 years or whatever, I had no engagement with the military. I lived in Glasgow. The military didn't come up to Glasgow. They went to Edinburgh or St. Andrews if they came to Scotland. They didn't dirty themselves. At that point, I had no interest in working with the military anyway. And it was only when I came to Australia and moved to the ANU, which is of course in Canberra and where you are, R.M. Williams' shoes are everywhere, that these opportunities arose. And I was a bit hesitant at first because I thought I'd like myself a lot less for working with the military. I was thinking about this as a kind of sellout and a little bit concerned. I'm quite critical of this language. I don't necessarily believe in it. Therefore, I don't especially want to teach it. And I'm more interested in the problems in it than how you can make it work. I found it to be hugely, hugely helpful. And I actually have found myself liking what I do a lot more since engaging with the military, because I see this language now less, just war theory, less as a parlor game, less as some kind of academic fancy or indulgence, and more as a way of having some really important conversations with people who are doing some very hard work, and actually engaging. And there is, even if I don't want to say that this is a perfect language, even if it's deeply imperfect and I want to say part of the problem, it, I think, is a language for living with the problem. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean there, hopefully, as we go along. So the conversations I've had with military personnel, and they've been, thanks to Charles in many ways for facilitating these down the years, they changed it because they had purpose, right? And they had heart in exactly the way that they make your stomach move in Tim O'Brien's language. But they also changed how I think about just war theory in several minor, but I think important ways, for me at least. Now, 2 points come to the fore, and I want to narrate these as we turn to the war stories. Number one, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the abstraction and detachment of contemporary just war theory. I mentioned the revisionist school earlier. I'm sure many of us here today are familiar with this work, and if you're not, God bless you, enjoy your ignorance. It's probably the dominant strain of just war theory today, and it is based on analytical political theory. Suffice to say, it trades heavily in far-fetched hypothetical examples. Richard Barrett spoke yesterday about trolley problems. Well, we've also got fat men falling down wells with laser guns and so on and so forth. And if anybody wants to plumb the depths of this, I'd draw your attention to Uwe Steinhoff's work, which is really, really smart, but also just exemplifies this trend. Now, it employs these otherworldly scenarios, not because they're just goofy by nature, but precisely to quarantine the theorist from the emotive realm of experience and memory, which revisionist scholars believe might corrupt or taint your reasoning. Their goal instead is to create a scenario which encourages the scholar, or in your case, the practitioner, to treat the ethics of war in a purely intellectual fashion. So to forget the local, parochial, personal investments that you might have when you remember this story or that, it's this country, that country involved in an event. We thus, the argument goes, might gain insight into what we might call the deep morality of war in their language. But this seems ass backwards to me, or at least deeply unhelpful, because it divorces the ethics of war from the experience of war, and in so doing reduces its utility for in-the-flesh combat personnel who encounter war in a visceral and embodied way. You don't encounter it as a trolley problem. It looks very different. So why would we play all of these abstraction games, which does not look anything like the practice that it ostensibly speaks to? Michael Walzer says something to this effect in his work when he says, the problem with revisionist just war theorists is they're far more interested in theory than war. So what we're trying to do is reconnect just war theory to war. Number two, my second thing. Here we return to Diomedes' words to Paris that we started with, you're all hairstyle and bedroom eyes. And I think just war theory of the style that I've just described is all hairstyle and bedroom eyes. By this, I mean it seduces us into believing its own hype. It tempts us to believe that if only we follow its edicts and act faithfully upon them, we can be confident we have done the right thing and then rest easy and sleep the sleep of the just. If, the wager goes, we engage just war theory in a felicitous way, we will have acted morally with no remainder and no residue left over, no guilt. Recoding war as applied ethics, it holds out the impossible promise of absolution and a clear conscience to soldiers who abide by its principles. So I think here of two things. I think of the language we spoke about yesterday, ethical armoring. We do just war theory as ethical armoring. And there's a sense that if we do this right, that you somehow inoculate yourself against the moral taint or corruption that war may impose upon you, that this language somehow protects you in that way. I also think about in medieval times when you went to war, when soldiers were obliged to do penance when they came back, even in the case of a just war. This was some kind of recognition of the fact that no matter how justly you waged the war, no matter how conscientiously you did it, there would always be some leftover, some residue, some remainder, some guilt, some sinfulness would have seeped in, as it were. So the idea that just war theory inoculates us against this is, in my view, hubris, plain and simple. And I think it's doubly problematic because then when you follow all its rules and you come back and you still feel crap about what you did, it feels like a betrayal. It feels like you've been set up. It feels like you've been sold a pack of lies. Now, I think this is just the nature of a discourse like just war theory, that it almost has to seal itself off, justify itself, and present itself to you as the answer, as the solution to the problem. When in fact, it's also part of the problem, as we saw with the Bush example. Doubling down, and does anybody know who these figures are here? So this is Ares and Athena, the two Greek gods of war. And I think the Greeks had it right when they identified war with two gods. Ares stood for destructive violence, the destructive violence that's intrinsic to warfare. He's brutish and bullish. He's an idiot. He runs into fences. He forgets who he's fighting against and charges into his own side. And he just generally makes a hell of a mess wherever he goes. Athena, on the other hand, who you'll recognize from her position above courthouses and so forth, stands for the idea that violence can be channeled and harnessed so that it serves political order rather than destroys it. So Athena stands for the ideal of the just use of force, and that the state properly ordered Weberian use of force. But what the Greeks want to, and in our kind of modern imaginary, we want to suppose, I think, that you can have one without the other, that Athena somehow surpasses or supplants Ares, that she is dialectically subsequent to him. But no, for the Greeks, they both went together. You can't have Athena without Ares, and you can't have Ares without Athena. Each begets the other. There is no such thing as Athena without Ares. And I think contemporary just war theory, because of the nature of the beast that it is, tends to sometimes forget this. And in doing so, it sells us a lie, a damaging lie. It's a necessary or noble lie, but a damaging lie. So enough about just war theory, for the moment at least. Let's set it aside as a kind of outside-in way of thinking about the ethics of war, the churchmen, in William Marshall's language. I want to take a quick look instead at how the ethics of war is narrated, not by theorists, but by practitioners. Instead then of seeking to divorce the ethics of war from the experience of war, I want to put them together. I want, in other words, to see how soldiers who have been in combat articulate the ethical dimension of that experience. So I've selected 4 memoirs by Australian troops to trial this approach. They're written by very different men about very different wars. We have World War I, World War II, Vietnam and the War on Terror. They all have the attraction of being, as one of the author puts it, totally Australian. And I'm going to try and extract some indicative snippets from these texts just for our consideration. So our first text Some of you may well have read it. It's Lieutenant Joe Maxwell's brilliant personal account of World War I, first published in 1932. It tells the story of his service at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. And though written in a lively and jovial style, as you can even probably gather from the title, it doesn't pull any punches. Maxwell is forthright in decrying the futility of war, his words, labeling it, quote, an insane folly that costs millions of lives and disorganized the whole world. And he refuses to sugarcoat what he experienced on the firing line. Here's his line. Often in the narrative, it will be necessary for the sake of truth to use the vernacular. Often one will have to use vulgar, downright vulgar language. But war is vulgar, hard, bitter. There's no softness about it, nor should there be any softness in the telling of it. As we get into the story, what we discover is a tale of disenchantment. The romantic vision of war that Maxwell had once harbored and which was possible to sustain so long as he remained far from the action was exposed as a grotesque lie on the front line. What undid it for Maxwell was the way war took bright young men who had once had hopes and dreams and turned them into putrefying carcasses. He recalls his first night in Gallipoli. Young boys who had been joking and laughing with one another just a few hours earlier now lay rigid in the brushy undergrowth. His language. So here, in this dismal, forbidding gully, brushed by the wings of death lay glory. It was not the heroic theatrical war of the history books. Those black bundles out there, dim and shadowy under the pale starlight, had not even struck a blow at their enemies. In fact, they had not seen a Turk. Yet there they were, cut down, scattered through the ravine, by an invisible enemy that had sprayed death from an indefinite vague ridge. To me, it seemed murder, nothing short of cold-blooded murder. I felt sick with the horror of it all. The story that follows is a tale of how the war robbed men of their own selves, dissolved the line between the living and the dead, and called every truth Maxwell had once known into question. Quote, living men and battered bodies were engulfed together in the waves of earth and mud flung up by the terrific fire. Blackened and bloodstained men crawled out of the chaos of mud and filth with the dead rolling into the cavities from which they emerged. Shells roared and crashed incessantly. There was not a star in the heavens. Despair and faint hope fought for the mastery of one soul. Would it be possible to live through this hell of hells? Surely not, he answers, but he refuses to believe that this is all there is. Our second text is Peter Metcalf's War in the Shadows, which tells the story of his time as a lance corporal in the infantry in Bougainville in 1944-45. The overriding theme to arise from Metcalf's narrative is that there were neither heroes nor cowards in a rifle company, only men who did their jobs, in his words. And if he uses the term men as a badge of honor, he is nevertheless painfully aware of how the war diminished him and his comrades. This plays itself out time and time again in the Clash Metcalf essays between the joy the men took in the beautiful shot cleanly taken and the stomach-churning gore that followed in its wake. He recalls the pride, the thrill, the gratification he took, not from killing per se, but from the performance of a perfect kill. Little beauty, the men exclaim as they execute a textbook ambush. Boy, you should have seen those Tojos run. And when his unit runs into and obliterates an enemy patrol, with Metcalf to the fore of the fighting, his reaction is euphoric. I was exultant. I was 10 feet tall. I bounded over logs and bushes, choking with excitement. I turned to Fergie running beside me. Did you see them go over? Jesus, we must have got at least 15 to 20. You little beauty. The laughter Metcalf describes among his troop is wild and whooping, primordial. Here, I think we have to ask ourselves, why is Metcalf sharing these moments with us? What is he trying to tell us in this? It seems to me that he's telling us something about the joy of war and the satisfaction of executing his duty. But he's also putting before us a record of the debasement, of his descent from a thoughtful young man to a callous brute. Indeed, the dark side of Metcalf's story is ushered in by a recurrent reference to the rancid remains of the enemy, soldiers whose lives they have ended. Clean shots are always followed by the spectacle of mortally wounded Japanese boys, quote unquote, groaning their life away, and later, the choking stench of rotting flesh. Of one Japanese soldier killed and left to decompose by the perimeter of his unit's camp, Metcalf writes, the smell persisted. It became stronger. Day by day, it was in our water, our food, our clothes, in every breath we took. Ultimately, it becomes clear that Metcalfe sees the putrefying enemy corpse as a metaphor for what the war had done to him and his men. In this country, he writes, everything rotted quickly, and we were no exception. Now, for the sake of time, there's a nice story which I'll pull out from him, but I'm going to skip past that. I'm going to skip past one of my favorite books, which is Barry Heard's wonderful, well done, Those Men. And I want to just jump briefly to a book by somebody who some of you here may well know as a colleague or even friend. This is Major General John Cantwell, and it's his, I think, hugely powerful book, Exit Wounds. It treats his experience of the Gulf War and of the more recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I won't go into much detail about it now because I intend to pick up on its messaging as I wrap up, but I will give you the broad gist of the work. It tells the story not just of Cantwell's service, but of the toll it took upon him. He opens the book with the admission that he suffers from chronic PTSD to the degree that he has required hospitalization at certain times. When we read on a little further, we learn that his suffering is not as a result of some act of wicked wrongdoing that he has personally committed, or any kind of carelessness or dereliction of duty on his part. In fact, the opposite appears to be the case. Cantwell presents himself as an extremely conscientious and dutiful person. He confesses to making mistakes and never claims to be flawless, but he also makes it very plain that he's always tried to give the best of himself to his job and to comport himself honorably and to play by the rules. Here then is your quintessential ordinary decent soldier, so to speak. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he finds the emotional toll of the war almost impossible to bear. The irony is biting. He who has done everything right to the best of his ability and who's always strived to act justly and to treat his enemy with compassion, nevertheless cannot escape the feelings of guilt and shame for the campaigns he has been a part of. This leads him, of course, to question everything he has ever believed in and indeed stood for. His book traces this very painful personal journey. What I take from these stories is a sense, I think they give us a window onto the absurd which many people encounter on the front lines. And that this is a product of the psychic split that war can engender, wherein we're forced to view our very being as, and I think Charles spoke to this yesterday, an instrument in someone else's hands, a tool, a means to an end, to be spent however they so choose. And on the other hand, as a unique, God-given and priceless, we are at one and the same time mere cannon fodder and the irreplaceable center of our own moral universe. Holding both these truths in one's mind at the same time is a bedeviling impossibility, but it's what soldiers are asked to do every single day. And this is hard to live with. And you don't need to take my word for it. This is General Cantwell's words to it, responding to the question of whether the wars he fought were worth the pain and suffering they caused. He writes, "Some will argue that the men and women we sent to war are all volunteers who know the risks and take them willingly. Others will say the casualties are the unavoidable cost of doing business in a combat zone. There is an argument that says the lives of a few sometimes need to be expended for a greater good. A cold, clear-eyed analysis of these claims tells me that they are all true, much as it pains me to admit it. But these arguments only work at the intellectual level. They do not make sense at the human level, the level at which every life is precious, where each soldier is someone and not just a number. These men had parents, sisters, brothers, parents, and children who loved them. 10 years from now, will anyone in Afghanistan remember that Australians shed blood for them? For a man like me, a lifetime soldier inculcated with a sense of duty and service, these are difficult questions to confront." From my point of view, I think in some ways this says it all. It tells you the answers that just war theory gives you, and it recognizes the truth of them, but it also recognizes the absurd difficulty of trying to live those truths. So finally then, bringing this to a conclusion, I want to suggest that attending to the experience of soldiers is important because not only does it illuminate the reality that war is always the work of both Ares and Athena, it also reminds us of the subjective dimension of war. That is to say, of the fragility, singularity, and absolute preciousness of every single human life that the state gambles when they go to war. I do not draw from this the lesson that just war theory is bunk or that states should never wage wars. Rather, I'm just saying that when they resort to military force, states and their leaders should be aware of and honest about exactly what they're asking of their service personnel, and that reading war stories can help with this. And I would like to see more engagement with the words, the experiences of Australia's own personnel when we think about events like this and how we talk about ethics of war education.
As I reflect on just war theory, it very much came out of the Western world, arguably North Africa at the time with Augustine of Hippo. And it's usually been with two countries that have been fairly, war at that time was really around countries of very similar values, very different, similar ethnicities. As we look at the world in which we live in at the moment, where we have a Western world and an Eastern world, we have a just war theory that is very Western in nature. We potentially are headed towards a world where there is friction between an Eastern world as well. How does just war theory transpose over those two different worldviews? And can you talk about that relationship of just war theory from a Western perspective with a war theory from an Eastern perspective?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Brigadier. Thank you. I think you're exactly right. So just war theory, and as we've articulated here, it's a product of Western Christian political theology. And so therefore you might say, well, if you're not a believer, why would you bother with this stuff? And we get people like Samuel Huntington coming out with Clash of Civilization in the 1990s, telling us that, you know, them over there believe something totally different and it's civilizationally incommensurable and so forth. Over Samuel Huntington, I prefer my friend John Kelsey, who wrote Just War and Jihad, among other books, and arguing about jihad. John is John left Catholic seminary school as a young man from Florida, and he's now he's in his 70s, and he's still working. And I asked him one day, I said, why are you still writing about jihad? Because he said he'd been quite upset watching the justification that the Jordanian ISIS gave for burning the Jordanian pilots. And he said what really upset him was he thought they gave the wrong justification, that he could have done a better job according to Islamic script. In other words, he knew Islamic scripture better than ISIS. And I said, why are you still doing this? Because it's taking a toll. And he said, well, I think it's really important work because these guys tell you that there's jihad and there's just war. One is from Mars, the other's from Venus. They have nothing to do with one another. But he said, actually, they're deeply interrelated and they're considerably overlapping, both presently and also historically. So we saw St. Thomas Aquinas up there earlier. Thomas Aquinas, one of the things that he did is he fused Augustine with Aristotle. And that's what gives us the kind of early modern European Western thought. He got Aristotle from Islamicist thinkers. He didn't know him originally. It was through Averroes and Avicenna and all these guys. So actually, just war and jihad have always been deeply historically interlinked, and they have far more in common than they have apart. And so Professor Kelsey, who I mentioned just a moment ago, part of what he sees as his mission, so to speak, is making the argument time and again, actually, if you subscribe to jihad, you still subscribe ultimately to most of the same edicts that inform just war theory and which are locked into and codified in international law. Don't believe these guys who are telling you that jihad is about that. It's not. So to come back, I've given the Western just war theory articulation because that's what I know. But there's considerable overlap and there's great work done in other cultural traditions. I think of somebody like Valery Morkavich's book on realist ethics, which also speaks to Confucian and Hindu ethics of war and how they overlap with the Western approach. Yeah, and there's quite a wide body of work now in comparative ethics of war, which is quite good. I just don't know any of it.
Ian, thanks very much for your presentation. Thought-provoking as ever. You raised the issue of are the military forces and the individuals, you know, merely a means to an end. How do commanders and statespeople balance the ends or the political ends of war,
the military means that are used to achieve that without solely making those people who they send to fight means to an end. How do they maintain their humanity? Where does that balance point, that golden mean lie?
So that's a challenging question. But I think it goes back to what we're doing today and what I would have us do. These political decision makers will, if we're lucky, have engaged with just war theory and international law and will know these things and will have had some schooling in this, or at least done some reading, had some tuition. Tony Blair famously was tutored by Lawrence Friedman on these things. And George H.W. Bush, we saw, was tutored by his pastor. I would like it if the ethics of war literature that they're getting is not so divorced from the experience of war, that it's actually informed by, engages with, and takes seriously what the experience of living these rules looks like. Not as an antidote to, but alongside, not as an alternative to, but alongside just war theory, just so that you're always aware of the price tag. You can still choose to spend those lives, but at least you're cognizant of what you're doing and of all that it means. So yes, I would, and I mean, this comes out of, so I've been working on the ethics of war for a long time. And one of the things where this project comes from and this line of work comes from is that I used to read war memoirs after, every couple of weeks to kind of try and keep myself a little bit honest about what you're doing, because otherwise the language seduces you into thinking that this is all clean and perfect and it ties up with a bow and, there's no problem. A lot of my colleagues, when I asked them, how would this particular just war end? What would victory look like in that? And they said, oh, I don't use the word victory. I use the term just cause accomplished. There's some war happens between going to war and the end, right? And people get killed and so forth. But the language entirely sanitizes that and it euphemizes it. And it does so necessarily so that you can have an intelligible conversation without breaking down into floods of tears. But it's useful to correct for that every once in a while. And I don't think our literature does a good enough job of that at the moment.
Just reflecting back to the dichotomy of, are you the Aries component? Do you feel like there's a component within the just cause that's missing for that destruction?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what I would like to see is that just war theorists stop telling themselves that you can do Athena without Ares, that you've got to pay attention to this, that Athena always brings Ares with it. You can't ever fully escape. And the nature of the literature as such is that it seduces you into believing that you can. And you can see why, right? Because it's a really hard thing to do, to say to somebody, this war is justified. I'm going to send young people to kill and be killed into harm's way. You want to have a damn good reason, and watertight reason for doing that. So the theory is really, when you inject the language of justice, it does that for you. It elevates what you're talking about. But it can also lead to self-righteousness, which leads you away from, the tawdry nature of the business and the fact that this is always a shonky compromise, right? Because you're settling a dispute of right by a contest of might. And that old cliche, war doesn't decide who's right, it only decides who's left. And so just war theory is always, I'd like to think of it as it's a way of coming to terms with the futility of war, of living with it and trying to make some meaning of it. But it is itself fundamentally, it's not a solution to the problem, it's part of the problem. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's massively clear, but we can chat about it later if you wish.
With the advent of autonomous systems and computerized weapon systems with decision-making capability that allow human soldiers to be more removed from the battlefield, do you feel that the dilution or removal of the human element of the soldier facing the on the ground experience of war has the potential to make it more ethical or less ethical as a consequence of having that direct personal element removed, not just in terms of the experience on the ground, we already have soldiers operating remote weapon systems, but in the sense that the decision may be somehow removed from the human in a way so as to create a sense of inoculation for those outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of colleagues are writing about and spending a lot of time thinking about, including today at the Bell School, where I typically teach. They're having a workshop on exactly this today, which is, I think, where Major General Mick Ryan is at the moment. Two brief responses on that from me would be, on the one hand, that's half the story, right? Because there's still bodies, there's still people dying. It's just not us in this story. And the second is the nature of the work. While you are inoculated and you may be on the loop rather than in the loop and so on, there's still the preceding period of time where people are living with, drone operators and the like are living with what people call the distant intimacy of tracking these figures who are then, what was served? Was that the language that we used yesterday? Who are then served on the kill list or whatever it's the acronym is. And of course, there's people like Peter Lee have written about the difficulty that some of the people in these weapon systems have experienced because of the feeling that the killing that they have been a part of has been like shooting fish in a barrel, that there has been no reciprocal kill or be killed moment. So the agonal kind of honor or nobility of the traditional soldiering ethic, the courage required to perform it, etc., that they're all absent, and that this is a debased, sinister, or cynical profession. So the problem shifts. I don't have that. That would be my brief answer to it.